Hey everyone, Yoyston and Royan here, and we would like to wish you all a happy Tolkien Reading Day. I believe this is the 20th official Tolkien Reading Day, as it has been run by the Tolkien Society since 2003, and today we commemorate the downfall of Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring, which happened on March 25th of 3019 of the Third Age. To newer and older fans alike, from those who have been lifelong readers and enjoyers of Tolkien's works, or to those who have only seen the movies or Rings of Power, or are even newer to Middle-earth, welcome and hail to you all. Today, my friend Royan and I, whom many of you know from our Rings of Power reviews, some live streams, and our Patreon-exclusive podcast, the Westernesse podcast, are going to be discussing this year's Tolkien Reading Day theme as a special event for our podcast. This is something different than other videos that I've done from past years about Tolkien Reading Day, but I do think that this could be really interesting and fun, so let me know if you all like this and would like to see more videos like this. And if you do, please consider supporting the channel through Patreon or YouTube memberships to find a link to our playlist with our nearly 60 podcast episodes that we've been doing monthly for a couple years now. So, Royan, my friend, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to this video and discussing these themes.
Absolutely, man. Great. It's always good to have you on for some good conversations. Before we get started, I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Zach and his wife, who just got me this Christmas sweater. I absolutely love it. So, yep, I wanted to give them a shout out. Thanks so much. Now, without further delay, let's begin our conversation on the theme for this year's Tolkien Reading Day, which is travel and adventure. So what we'll do is kind of approach this like we approach any topics in our podcasts. We'll talk about this theme at large, how it impacts the works, and our favorite adventures in the works and why. Thank you all again for joining us. So let's just jump into it. Our last podcast episode was actually really interesting because we talked about the theme of home and why home and the journey back to one's home is rather important within the works at large, right? What that does with the archetypal hero's journey, how the Scouring of the Shire and so forth fits into that. But now we're talking about almost the opposite part in that archetypal hero's journey cycle, right? The theme of travel and adventure. Royan and I, we were talking a little bit about it before we started to record, and it seems almost like you can't have an interesting adventure or an interesting novel, book, video game, movie, anything like that. Story, yeah, without some sort of travel and adventure. So looking at the theme at large, Royan, what do you think about it, especially in regards of Tolkien's works?
So adventure is, we talked a bit about the hero's journey in the last episode of the podcast. If you're not familiar with it, basically, you start out at home, something happens, you leave, you grow along the way, you overcome obstacles, great things happen, and then you come back home. So we talked about the beginning and ending there and how you leave home and then you come back changed for the better, hopefully. Mm-hmm. But the biggest chunk of the pie there is what I would call the adventure, the things that happen outside of your home in the story. And it's not just a physical home, wherever your character's house is, but it can be, their place of comfort, maybe even in their own minds, anything like that. I think we'll dive into more of those in a little bit. But yeah, as far as the adventure is where things happen. That is everything. Especially in fantasy stories, we try to take that a little bit literally, and we craft these ideas and these stories of grand quests, monsters to overcome and things like that. And so where I would say it like contrasts most with the theme of home is in these places where it is where the learning is done. It is mm-hmm. the objects and the obstacles that need to be overcome, and through this process the character grows. Even the reader can grow to learn more about both the characters and even themselves. As you watch or read somebody go through something, you get the thought in your mind of how would I do in this situation? What would this instance change about myself and the way I think about things? And yeah, so like it's such a large item, a large idea, and it's basically what I would call the crux of almost every story, especially the ones that I enjoy the most, which are fantasy stories.
Yeah.
So, what about you?
I totally agree. And the idea with adventure is like, that's where the shaping of the person happens. I can't really remember the quotes very well right now, but the idea that we've seen even throughout philosophies, throughout human history and so forth, is like that to work steel, you have to put it in the fire, right? To even make a beautiful statue of marble, like you have to start the chiseling. It has to be cut out of labor and hardship. Hard work, responsibility, discipline, all of these things to create something beautiful. And that is what the adventure aspect, that portion of the archetypal hero's journey seems to really be. It is that being in the fire, right? Being hardened and tempered as steel and so forth, right? It's not always comfortable. In fact, it's usually not comfortable. And that's what gets you out of that physical comfort zone, but maybe even an emotional or a spiritual or a mental comfort zone as well to grow that character. I feel like the best archetypal hero's journey, at least like the most, archetypal of it, is the Bilbo journey within The Hobbit. Of all of the adventures within Tolkien's works, that seems to be the most archetypal one, right? You've got this person who is like as soft as people can be. Sure, he's got a little bit of almost like this genetic desire through his Tookish blood to where it's like, I do kind of want to see what's outside the borders, but honestly, I've left that part of myself behind. I am a refined and notable hobbit now of great respect, and I don't want to do anything outside of the ordinary. But then, right, Gandalf, who just is like adventure incarnate, comes and just like shoves him out the door kind of thing. And then as we see his journey happen, right, there are moments perhaps where he could turn back or things like that, where he could escape the archetype. But rather, Bilbo embraces the archetype and he becomes this hero who is even in many ways more heroic than the others he's traveling with, than this great dwarvish king, Thorin, and then Gandalf in some ways, because he does things that only he could do. And people seem to really use archetypes within our world to like learn a lot more about the world and to learn a lot more about themselves. Superhero movies over the last 10, 15 years are so full of archetypes and people love them. Now, the problem with archetypes is like if they're overdone or if they become cliche or tropey.
They just if they become more obvious.
Totally.
Then I think a lot of people begin to pick up on things. We start using the words tropey or like overdone, overused.
Yeah. And that's I'm glad you mentioned that too, because what's interesting with the Lord of the Rings is, sure, there are definitely archetypal heroes' journeys within Lord of the Rings, but they're actually not as predictable as they are, I would even argue, within The Hobbit. Because, like, even take Bilbo in the Lord of the Rings. It's his birthday right off the bat, all of this stuff, but this is post-adventure Bilbo. This is post-archetypal hero's journey Bilbo. He's been somewhat corrupted by the ring, right? It's not been necessarily just a happy ever after, but he's been corrupted, long-lived for sure. But he's not also as respected as he used to be. If you never read The Lord of the Rings and you just kind of end with The Hobbit, it almost feels like, well, he got the gold, he found out more about himself, he became a hero, all of this kind of stuff, and then he must have just lived happily ever after, with his friends, Balin and Gandalf visiting him from time to time. But that's not what we get with The Lord of the Rings. There's this darker aspect to it, and then also like this more hopeful aspect when he becomes this sage storyteller kind of guy. But the darker aspect is that, he wasn't really respected as much in his community. People really thought he was odd and weird, and it would best serve other hobbits to not quite be like him. Be like him before he went off into the blue. But don't be like how he is now, because he's just too strange. So then he has to leave again, almost as like somewhat of this... he chooses to leave, but I feel like the other hobbits were like, oh, that's probably for the best because he's too weird to be among us. Like, he's almost in self-exile from his own land because it didn't go back to what it once was. The Shire was not where it was at the beginning of the cycle. So then all of a sudden you have this continuation, this Tolkienian continuation of the archetypal hero's journey, where he has to figure out to be something else. And that something else is a storyteller. It's a writer. It's a poet. Somebody who brings others up and uses that wisdom and so forth. During the Council of Elrond, it's interesting because he almost says like, well, Frodo, my lad, this isn't your burden. This isn't your responsibility. I started this thing, so I should be the one to take the ring to Mordor. And I think it's Gandalf in the book that says, like, no, it's, your time with the ring has kind of passed, right? Unfortunately, this has become someone else's burden. And it's just an interesting way to continue that archetypal hero's journey until he goes off into the West. And then we assume he has that happily ever after sort of moment. But within Tolkien's works, again, you have The Hobbit, which is, in my mind, the most archetypal and, in a way, simplistic of the hero's journey. But then you have all of these other variations of it, which is super interesting, too. So, Ryan, what are some of your, I guess we can jump into some of the favorite things and how this connects to the greater theme at large. What are your favorite adventures and stories of travel within Tolkien's works?
Well, I mean, the War of the Ring is the most obvious because it's the one that we have the most experience with. And I want to kind of zoom in a little bit. I want to talk about Sam. Sam, who is the greatest of characters. So Sam, when we talk about archetypal heroes' journeys, Sam is a gardener. He's a gardener because his dad is a gardener. He's living in the Shire. He's doing the Shire life. He's not a lord. He's not a head of household. He's not even rich. He's a servant, essentially. But through things that are outside of his control, mainly Gandalf, he gets shoved into this adventure attached to, Frodo. And I think the movies do like a great job of showing that Sam and Frodo were like great friends, but in the actual like works, it's more like a employer-employee kind of situation. So totally, it's not exactly the most exciting adventure start for Sam, but he takes it in great stride. Which, to his credit, I think it really speaks a lot to his character, is that Sam is the kind of hobbit that is willing, maybe not, super excited, but is willing to go on this adventure, to leave the Shire. And this is a huge theme surrounding the Shire, is that there are only a small set of hobbits who are willing to leave for any reason. Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Pippin and Merry, and maybe there's a couple other ones along the way, but mostly these are the characters that look at this minority and they think there's got to be something wrong with them, because why would you leave?
We got it great here. What are you doing?
Exactly. And so Sam gets on his story, and Sam, in a lot of ways, he is changed by the journey. He's changed by the events at Amon Hen. He's changed by the events in the Trollshaws. He's changed by the events in Moria, and so on and so forth. Bree, I forgot about Bree. He gets terrified Strider at Bree. All these things that happen to him. But at the same time, he is a bit of he kind of works against the theme a little bit of being changed along the adventure, because he is a representation of home. I think Peter Jackson does a great job, exploring this when we start talking about the, he pulls out like the seasoning. It's like, I think it's in Return of the King. Frodo is just like, why do you have this? Why did you bring this out? And he's just like, because I thought we might want a taste of home. It's a small gesture, but it speaks a lot to what Sam is for Frodo. Sam is the constant reminder about what Frodo is suffering for, why he's doing it. And it helps that he's just a good boy that everybody loves.
And Sam's arc is it is probably one of the more archetypal within the Lord of the Rings itself, just like isolated, because he is able to return home, free his home, but also like he kind of, he gets married, he has the kids, and he's able to live that happy ever after life, though he does miss Frodo. And in the end, he eventually does go to Valinor himself, but like within the context of like the War of the Ring and the events of the main Lord of the Rings books, right? He has a really archetypal one, and it's good, and I think that's why so many people identify and really love Sam as well, is because you see it. You see how the love of his master versus the desire to be a warrior, or the desire to kill, is what puts him in front of Shelob, one of the greatest monstrosities of the Third Age. It's because of love, it's all for love, and it's all to avert the suffering of his master and so forth, That's why he does it. And there's even this heartbreaking moment when he thinks Frodo is dead in the book, and he thinks, I can't go on. Like, he was my purpose too. But then all these other people are counting on us to destroy the ring. And so, like, he even contemplates, like, ending his story there, right? And, in a more subtle way of saying it. But, like, it's a pretty sad moment because Frodo and his love for Frodo is so much of his purpose. But then he's able to push on, he cares so much for our protagonist that he saves him again from the Tower of Cirith and, even literally carries him up, Mount Doom and so forth. And, like, that is true strength that comes from the adventure, that comes from the travels that he's been through.
Exactly. And there's no way Sam could have pulled that off. The Sam that left the Shire could have done that without the changes that he gathered along the way, without the I say man, but he's a hobbit. Without the hobbit that he grew to become. And
absolutely.
That is what adventure is, the theme. That's what it's about. It's about changing yourself to become better.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that same vein, for me, as I think about this, you can talk about almost every character arc and find some sort of, is there the archetypal hero's journey? Does it go away from the hero's journey and so forth? But for me, within Tolkien's works, other than Bilbo and Sam, the three that really stand out as I'm thinking about this are Frodo, Aragorn, and Turin Turambar. And so I want to kind of dive into those three because they have the travels and the adventure does something different to each of these characters, right? So Frodo, his is interesting because even though he's like the protagonist of The Lord of the Rings, he doesn't really have the archetypal hero's journey in many ways. Sure, he goes there and back again, but it's horrific. And it's psychologically horrific as well, because when he returns home, it's not just like that he's changed, kind of like Bilbo was, where it's just nothing is the same anymore. It's like, I am scarred, and I won't ever not be scarred. I will always carry these things with me. And as time goes on, every anniversary of Weathertop and every anniversary of Shelob's Lair, he felt those pains again. He felt those scars again. And he realized after a couple of years, he always would. Always. And so with adventure and travel comes pain, loss, and suffering as well. In the trailer, I want to say, for the Return of the King movie, there's some quote like, there's no victory without sacrifice, something like that. And it's very true for Frodo, right? He saved the rest of the world, but at a heavy cost to himself. I'm almost reminded of the Nietzsche idea with, do not gaze too long into the abyss, for the abyss will gaze into you. Be careful if you fight monsters to not become a monster yourself, right? Because he doesn't become a monster, but, well, I guess for one moment he does when he's trying to destroy the ring and he decides, oh, no, the ring is mine. I am the Lord of the Rings. Like, boom, he's the monster all of a sudden because he gazed too long into the abyss, which was the One Ring. And so he did carry scars, and of all the hobbits, he went through the most trauma. And it's really tough to see, what his arc did to him. Concerning Frodo, Royan, do you have anything to add with that journey?
I mean, we talk about change, we talk about adventure, and it is, it's not the most archetypal story, but it's kind of variation about people who go out, they are changed, and they come back changed. They come back worse. And I think this is a theme that has become a lot more, at least in America, it's become a lot more prominent after the Vietnam War. Because, all wars are terrible for the people that fight them. But some are worse than others. When Americans went across to fight in the Pacific and in Europe during World War II, it was terrible. But when they went and fought in Vietnam, it was so much worse. And these people would come back, and they would come back scarred for the rest of their life with PTSD and all these things. And so at the end of the day, this tale about Frodo, and it is echoed a lot in a lot of modern fantasy, I would say as well. It's still a part of this. It's still a part of this theme about sometimes the adventure can, sometimes the adventure can be worse for you, especially if you leave a part of yourself out there and it doesn't make its way back home.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. In all war, you definitely have an element of that. Whether or not you're fighting against something that is nearly pure evil, like an ideology that is pure evil, or not, right? Whether it's more complicated than that, there's always that part of the soldier that gets left behind on the field. And it's tragic. And I think that's part of the sorrow of the end of The Lord of the Rings, is because he sails west, and finally the dream that he had in Tom Bombadil's house is revealed, thus ending his arc, right? He sees the he sees the gray skies kind of pull back and so forth. That quote that Gandalf gives in the movies, in Return of the King to Pippin, right? He sees all of that kind of happen, and then he realizes like he will make it, he will be okay in Valinor. And there's something very beautiful about that, because that's a sort of relief that most people, right, with those scars don't quite maybe get in some ways. And that gets a bit more into Turin's character, which I actually think I want to talk about his arc last of these three. So next we have Aragorn, the thing that's really interesting, because Aragorn is my favorite fictional character of all time, and in part it's because of the arc he goes through, right? He's almost like part of the way done with his arc by the time that the story ends. You can tell that he's got more to do. Sure, yes, he's king. Yes, he's married to Arwen and so forth. Those arcs are complete. But, like, he's still got to go north again, reclaim the north in actuality. Even though he's already king of the north, like, no one in the north really knows that in Bree until the hobbits start to spread the word. So he's got, like, work to do. Of all the characters, he's probably got the most work to do at the end of The Lord of the Rings. And why I think that's really interesting is because you go back to when he was going from his 20s to his 80s, and after he fell in love with Arwen, he went out to find adventure purposefully, to find trials that would challenge him to become, quote, the hardiest of living men. And that idea is so inspiring. That idea of, like, he felt like, okay, not only do I have to, like, earn the love of Arwen, who comes from this lineage far greater, not necessarily better, but far greater than mine, but even though I'm proud of my lineage, I have to earn that. I have to earn being the heir of Elendil. And eventually, when Elrond says, my daughter will not marry for any less than the king of both Arnor and Gondor, he goes out and gets that work done. He becomes even hardier and hardier. Like, he's like, all right, got it. Like, I've got
talk about Elrond,
I've got the objective.
Moving the goalposts on him, like
totally.
It's like, it definitely. Listen, you're cool, you're great, but we expect more in this household. Okay. We expect a little bit more. That's great for you that you're still the strongest of living men, but we still need more. Exactly. And so, because that was after Arwen and he had become engaged at Ciaran Amroth and Lothlorien, that they had that conversation. It's like, it's totally moving the goalpost, but Aragorn knew his objective. He knew exactly what his aim, maybe not exactly what his aim was, because there's still part of the adventure, part of the travel is journeying into the unknown. He didn't know if he could defeat Sauron. He didn't know if he could even really partake in something that would lead to his downfall or the rising of those two kingdoms again, but he would do whatever he could to accomplish those goals. And so, of maybe every character within Tolkien's works, Aragorn embraces the idea that, like, adventure and travels are trials to try yourself against to become greater. And so that's why he did all of this good as Thorongil, going to journey in Rohan and aid them there, journeying in Gondor to aid them there, but he doesn't really stick around for the victory. He's like, okay, on to the next task, because I've become stronger from this task in the pursuit of my greater goal. He's hitting these reps, man. He's like, he's doing these different workouts pretty much, which are these travels and these adventures. And so I love that, because again, it's the most inspirational of stories. It's the most inspiring of stories out there, to where the adventure within ourselves as readers, we have to go out into the unknown, into the wild. It could be physically, but it could also be mentally, or within just the context of our lives as the adventure. We have to go try to get those degrees, try to get those jobs, try to become good at those jobs, and so forth. So we grow as people. So we see other points of views. So we gain wisdom. And I think that is awesome. And that's one of my favorite
character arcs in all of fiction right there, because it's just, yeah, it's one of the most inspiring for sure. So, Rowan, do you have anything to add with Aragorn before we move into Turin's?
I mean, Aragorn even acts as a part of this hero's journey for the Hobbit characters. He is an example of somebody who's done this before, who's been there, done that, and made it back, which is, I think, a huge reason why they feel that they even could succeed. Why these characters, they volunteer, because they see people like Aragorn and they realize, well, he is a man that can do it, so I can as well. And I think that's a huge part of our individual adventures in our own lives. We talk about, you talked a little bit about how we can change ourselves in our lives, and that starts with good examples, with role models of people who have been there, people who have done it. And it doesn't have to be the perfect person, but maybe just somebody who did this one thing, and that can be enough for that can be enough to help push you along the way. I hesitate to talk about this because it's a little bit of a weird topic, but it is really, I think, really important. It really helps get my point across here. Talking about people who struggle with addiction. Me personally, I have familial connections to people who have experienced alcoholism and Alcoholics Anonymous in the United States. I'm not 100% certain how that translates across the world, but essentially this is just a support group for people who struggle with addiction to alcoholic. And they have this process where at the start it's every week, and then it turns into every month, and it becomes every year. And you get a chip. You go to the meeting and you get a chip for however long you've been. If you've been sober for a month, you get a 1 month chip. If you've been sober for 2 years, you get a 2-year chip. And that there's every once in a while in media and even in real life, people will kind of balk at that and be like, I don't need a prize for myself. I think that's a little vain or something like that. And it serves to remind that we don't give these people chips because we're trying to honor them. We give it so that we can show everybody else in the room that you can do it too. You can get there.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
That's what Aragorn is to the hobbits, I feel like, especially at the beginning of the story, this kind of enigmatic character. But they can look at him and they can see, if he can do it, I think I can at least do this.
Yeah.
If he can do all of that, if he can be all that he is, everything that he is, and the more that gets revealed about him, the more grand he becomes, then I can get through this next phase of the journey. I can get to Rivendell, and then I can get across the Misty Mountains, and then I can get to Mordor, etc.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's leading with example. It's him growing into his own, and it's like, right, we've got the strongest of men helping us, and if he can't do it, then no one can. But we're going to take the bet that we can do it because we've got the best that we could have on our side, right? And that is inspirational. And I think, that's definitely a moving story, Ryan, and moving connection for sure. And it's powerful to see, even if Aragorn wasn't thinking about it all times, or like any of us do, what we can do just through our actions to inspire others, right? Just by being ourselves and by doing our best. That's, I think, the key thing is Aragorn was trying to do the best for himself and for the world, trying to be the best version of himself that he could be. And in doing that, he had all of these side effects as well of inspiring others, even maybe when he didn't mean to. And that's pretty powerful. And it's an interesting transition to Turin's character arc, because it's almost like a mixture of Aragorn's to some degree, with becoming strong and becoming this warrior and becoming fierce. But then also there is this sorrow element too. I almost see Turin's story arc as the monster versus the light, the chaos versus the order within one's personage. He reminds me a lot of Anakin, Turin. And I've mentioned this on other podcasts and things like that. But he was born into a time when things were kind of on the up and up and everything like that. Like, his father was going to go fight this battle alongside King Fingon. Hurin was going to go fight in the Nernaeth Arnoediad, what happened to be the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and then things just went horribly after that. But Turin kind of remembers this time when his first sister was still alive, and, having these good times with her before she passed away, before Morgoth broke the forces of the North and all of this kind of stuff. And then the sorrow starts to seep into his life. And it's kind of this kid struggling just to keep hope at all and to keep ties with his family and so forth. Eventually, obviously, he's sent to live with Thingol and all of that. And he becomes this warrior. As time goes on, he almost has this, he becomes so great of this warrior that it's almost this Superman problem, especially when he gets Girthang. He almost cannot physically lose a battle one-on-one. Sure, right, there are some greater battles that he did take part in that, he did lose or something like that, when the orcs ambushed him and captured him, or with the fall of Nargothrond. But usually when it was just him versus one other being, he won against that being at some point, physically. And so it's almost this Superman problem where he can't lose, he can't be killed, because that's almost an easy out of the curse of Morgoth. And so you've got this guy struggling with his inner nature of being a warrior, and the world around him forcing him to be this dark and grim warrior. But then this guy who eventually realizes that he just brings chaos and destruction and brutality wherever he goes. And so eventually he goes to the woods and becomes Turambar. He tries to leave his past behind. He even settles down, marries his sister, but he didn't know that. But he's very happy until the echoes of his past return, until Glaurung, the dragon, comes forth from Nargothrond and starts making his way towards Turin. And it's like, well, I have to embrace my shadow. I have to become that warrior that I kind of once hated to some degree. I have to become that again. I have to draw up the black sword. I have to go forth and do what I can for my people, even though it might cost me everything. Eventually kills Glaurung, but he seems almost killed, right, based on kind of how it goes. He's knocked out. Then his sister wife figures out the truth from Glaurung when he reveals it to her. She passes away of her own volition. And then Turin learns all of this. And at the end, he is simultaneously Turambar, this guy who's made a good life for himself and for his people, this leader. He's also Turin, who is this warrior, who's just this killer. He's an agent of chaos. But then he's also broken. And that, he ends up taking his own life as well. And it's like this incredibly beautiful but dark and twisted character arc that's not that it follows maybe some archetypal beats, but it reminds me of Kratos from God of War, whereas Kratos in the newer games was able to kind of put aside his past through great struggle and all of this, make a better life for his son, or he's trying to with Atreus, if anyone's played the God of War games, versus the old God of War games where he's kind of like Turin and like Turin's beginning days. He is rage incarnate. He is destruction, and I will bring down anyone who gives me reason to do so and all of this kind of stuff. But it's like, even though you get what you wanted in that moment, you still brought chaos and suffering to others. So is that really what you wanted to do? And so Turin has to struggle with the monster and embracing the shadow within his own mind, within his own self, to do something that is overall greater to help others, which is killing Glaurung, but at great cost to himself. It destroys himself.
Yeah.
So it's probably, in my mind, it's the most complicated character arc in Tolkien's works. It's the travel, the adventure makes him better, but it breaks him, but it also embraces this monster. It's just wild. And that is what his character arc, that's what his journeys, his adventure, his travel does. And it's really, really fascinating to me. I love the character of Turin, although I do admit that he's a monster in his own way. And it's just really fascinating. Feanor has an interesting character, like a similarly, I'm an agent of chaos kind of character arc. And he does have that moment of clarity at his end where he's like, oh, I see, he's seeing the Thangorodrim as he's about to pass away, and he realizes my people won't be able to do this. And then he passes away anyway. It's very similar to that, but in my mind, Turin's character arc is like, it's way more complicated and just, he's a hero, but he's a tragic hero. He's an anti-hero. He's a villain at times. Like, it's wild. So, yeah, that's another one that speaks to me. Ryan, do you have any thoughts about Turin's arc?
I mean, Turin's arc is just I think you're right when you say he's the most complicated, the most twists and turns, and I hesitate to say best because I think that Aragorn's has more to it that you kind of have to peel back to see some more. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the most obviously best characters in Lord of the Rings, and it's tragedy. It's almost Shakespearean in its nature of tragedy, and I think he kind of he plays a lot into that role about how you leave parts of yourself on the journey and you become changed for the worse sometimes, or parts of you, and then how that impacts the rest of your life, the people in your life, and things like that. And he's such a good character. I really love Turin. I've said on many a podcast that if I had to pick the next thing to be adapted, if I was in charge, they gave me the hat, I would want a video game kind of styled like God of War, the new God of War games, God of War and God of War Ragnarok, based on Turin Turambar. I think that would be a really, really good story. I think its level of tragedy is modern enough to where I think it could really gain a great audience. So, I think it would be fantastic and awesome. But it's definitely sad.
It is. It's very, very sad, very complex. And then, obviously, right, you have to kind of begin to wrap things up. You've got so many character arcs that's impacted differently by adventure. Boromir's kind of corruption throughout the adventure, but that his heart remained true in the end. That travels did Theoden good in the end. He was able to pull himself. Well, Gandalf pulled him back, and then Theoden spent the rest of his days in adventure, in trials, in combat, and so forth. And it's a really big theme. And again, I would say like the theme of home, the theme of travel and adventure, and then like the theme of hope at large are just, there are many more as well, but those three are almost like the driving triumvirate of themes within Tolkien's works. They're the triad of themes of many of his greatest characters and stories. And I would say, right, that it's a good theme for this year in terms of Tolkien Reading Day. So, Ryan, do you have anything else to kind of wrap things up with this conversation?
No, I think that I'm really happy with the things that we were able to bring apart. I'd love to see in comments and things like that how other journeys and adventures that stick out to you guys, and obviously this is all about Lord of the Rings. It's Tolkien Rating Day, but also in other medias. If you've got one that you think is really nice, tell us about it.
Absolutely. Ryan, thank you again so much for the conversation, for joining me today. It's been great, man.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. My friends, thank you all so much for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout. Please check out our merch and Patreon, especially our Patreon and YouTube membership, for more conversations like this. Thanks to our Valar Tier patrons and YouTube members: Peter Sheppard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralick, Molly Sullivan, Blair Scouten, Merten, John Hume, Sam McBee, Matt Sibbach, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibs, Rhys Jenkins, Adam Petrlik, Anthony Harmon, Dorwin Gray, Arthur Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswald Project, Robert Bogue, and King of Games 2500. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members. Thank you to all of you for tuning in today. Happy Tolkien Reading Day, my friends. Go enjoy the adventures that you all are on, and enjoy the works of Tolkien. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.